The circuit closed. On the muddy banks of the Yazoo River, a Confederate volunteer made a small, nearly silent motion, closing a circuit in some accounts or pulling a line in others, sending a signal to a concealed charge below. It required less force than firing a musket, but it translated instantly into violence under the brown water. A submerged mine, what the era called a torpedo, detonated in the channel. The blast drove a shockwave straight up through the water column and into the hull passing overhead. This event, occurring on December 12, 1862, marked a permanent shift in naval warfare. It is widely cited as the first time an armored warship was sunk by a remotely detonated mine, an electrically fired torpedo in the language of the day. The target was the United States ship Cairo. She was a city-class ironclad, designed for the brutal close-quarters combat of the American inland rivers. She was about 175 feet long and about 51 feet wide, a flat-bottomed casemate vessel pushing a heavy center paddle wheel. Her sides carried roughly 2.5 inches of iron plating backed by thick wood, meant to blunt solid shot from shore batteries. She was a machine built to dominate the surface. Her engineers had accounted for cannon fire, ramming, and rifle volleys, not for a kill switch waiting under the keel. 2 explosions struck in quick succession, close enough to feel like one. They didn't just bruise iron, they broke the wooden bones that kept her afloat. The river water, cold and heavy with silt, rushed into the forward compartments. The physics of the loss were dictated by the design of the ship itself. The Cairo was a shallow draft vessel, essentially a heavy iron box floating on a wooden raft. Once the integrity of that raft was compromised, the weight of the armor and the 13 heavy guns became a liability. The margin for error was non-existent. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Selfridge, realized the ship was doomed within seconds of the detonation. There was no time for damage control or counter-flooding. The only strategic objective remaining was the preservation of the crew. Selfridge drove the sinking ironclad toward the riverbank, hoping to ground her in the mud before she slipped beneath the surface entirely. The paddle wheel churned the water, fighting the drag of the flooding bow, but the Yazoo was deep and the timeline was unforgiving. In about 12 minutes, the battle was over. The Cairo slid off the bank and settled into the darkness. The smokestacks disappeared. The flagstaff vanished. The water smoothed over the site as if the ship had never existed. Remarkably, because of the discipline of the crew and the proximity to the shore, no lives were lost, though several men were injured. Every man made it off the vessel. They stood on the decks of the supporting ships and watched their iron fortress vanish. The way she went down created a rare preservation environment. Usually when a warship is lost, it is consumed by fire, magazine detonations, or a slow breakup in storms. The ship that reaches the bottom is often a burned-out husk or a scattered debris field. The Cairo was different. She went down relatively intact and was rapidly sealed by river mud. Many objects remained where they had been left. Tools, personal gear, shipboard fittings, captured by silt before currents and scavengers could strip the interior clean. But preservation was uneven. The mud slowed many destructive processes without stopping degradation altogether. The Cairo was not a perfect wreck, it was a fragile archive entombed in sediment. The rapid sinking created a paradox. Men watched the Cairo vanish and still believed they could point to the spot, but a river does not hold still for human memory. The Yazoo runs heavy with silt, and the current keeps rewriting the bottom. In months, the wreck began to disappear beneath sediment. Over decades, banks shifted, landmarks vanished, and the channel migrated. The Cairo did not just sink. In practical terms, she slipped out of reach and into legend. 102 years is long enough for a river to move the goalposts. By 1956, historians could narrow the search to a stretch of water, not a set of coordinates. Somewhere under moving brown current and deep alluvial mud, the ironclad waited, hidden by the same sediment that had covered her. The search for the vessel was not conducted with side-scan sonar or magnetometers towed by research vessels. In 1956, it was led by a historian named Edwin Barse, working from wartime reports and local knowledge, and using a simple pocket compass to hunt for a magnetic disturbance. The Cairo was a dense concentration of iron, armor, machinery, and guns, lying in a riverbed of non-magnetic silt and clay. The trick was a magnetic anomaly. A compass should ride true on the Earth's field. until a dense mass of iron tugs it off north as you pass over it. Barce steered a small boat back and forth across the suspect stretch, eyes fixed on the glass dial. Then the needle kicked hard off north. They circled and it jumped again, enough to make them reasonably convinced they had found her. In 1959, divers finally brought up a piece of armor from the bottom, turning a compass swing into proof. The team followed up with long steel probes. They manually drove the rods down through the water column and into the river bottom. In water reported at about 6 fathoms, roughly 36 feet, the probe struck something solid that felt like iron rather than rock or submerged timber. The depth was significant. 36 feet in the Yazoo is not like 36 feet in the clear ocean. It is a zone of near zero visibility where current and suspended silt turn every movement into a struggle. The environment at the bottom was hostile. The find was promising, but the condition of the ship was unknown. A hard contact could mean an intact casemate or a broken structure buried under layers of mud. To the men in the boat, the needle swing was a victory, but it was also a warning. They had located the ironclad, but reaching it would demand engineering, patience, and respect for the river. Down there, silt and low oxygen bought time, but only unevenly. Over a century, some materials endured astonishingly well, while other timbers weakened in ways that stayed hidden until they were disturbed. When divers finally reached into the interior, they recovered personal gear and shipboard objects still carrying the imprint of 1862. Boots, utensils, fittings, fragments of daily life lifted out of black mud. It felt like time had been interrupted, not preserved perfectly. And the same sediment that shielded these artifacts also locked the hull in place, gripping it with powerful suction. To recover the vessel, the salvage team still faced a basic rule of lifting. You cannot hoist a ship by its top. You must cradle it from below. But the Cairo was not sitting neatly on the riverbed. She was embedded in fluid mud that collapsed the moment it was disturbed. Divers used water jets and dredging techniques to wash narrow paths through the sediment and work slings beneath the hull. In that black water, the work became tactile, hands on mud, hands on timber, inch by inch, until the rigging could be set. The final rigging consisted of massive steel cables, 3 inches in diameter. These were not ropes, they were heavy industrial strands capable of withstanding immense tension. The plan was to loop these cables under the hull at key structural points, creating a basket that would support the ship as it was pulled out of the mud. On paper, the physics worked. The cables were strong enough to lift the weight. The jetting had been successful. The straps were in place. The salvage team believed they had solved the geometry of the recovery. They had accounted for the weight of the iron and the suction of the mud. But they had missed a critical variable in the material science of the hull itself. The white oak timbers were preserved, yes, but they were also waterlogged and structurally compromised in ways that were not visible to the naked eye. The team was about to apply modern industrial force to a structure that had the compressive strength of a wet sponge. The interface between the 3-inch steel cables and the wooden hull was the weak point in the equation, and as the tension mounted, that interface would become the site of a catastrophic failure. The fundamental error in the salvage plan was a conflict of geometry. The lifting cables were round steel ropes. The hull of the Cairo was a flat wooden plane. When you pull a round cable against a flat surface under extreme tension, the contact area is infinitesimally small. It creates a single line of immense pressure. If the flat surface is steel, it holds. If the flat surface is waterlogged oak that has been soaking in a river for a century, the physics change entirely. In October 1964, the salvage fleet assembled over the site. The hardware was formidable: floating derricks, winches, and industrial rigging built to move heavy structures. But they weren't lifting the Cairo as she had been built. They were lifting her effective load: iron and waterlogged structure, water and mud trapped inside compartments, and the riverbed's suction all at once. The ship was no longer just a vessel. She was a buried container of silt, and the strain crept toward the limits of the gear. The order was given to lift. The crane engines roared to life, taking up the slack on the massive guide wires. The 3-inch cables tightened around the belly of the ironclad buried below. On the surface, the barges dipped low in the water, straining against the load. The tension gauges climbed. Down in the dark, the cables bit into the mud and found the hull. For a brief moment, the ship moved. The suction broke. But then the resistance changed character. The cables did not snap. The derricks did not fail. Instead, the salvage team witnessed the physics of the biscuit cutter effect. A biscuit cutter works because the thin metal edge applies high pressure to a small area, allowing it to pass effortlessly through the dough. The lifting cables acted exactly the same way. The steel was harder than the wood. As the tension exceeded the compressive strength of the white oak, the cables stopped lifting the ship and started slicing through it. They cut through the outer planking, they sheared through the heavy frames. The cables sawed upward through the body of the ship, slicing the vessel into thirds. The hull was not being raised, it was being murdered by the very tools designed to save it. The noise must have been horrific, the sound of 100-year-old timbers snapping and crushing under the constricting force of the steel loops. The lift was aborted, but the damage was irreversible. The integrity of the hull was gone. The single rigid unit of the Cairo had been converted into 3 disconnected sections held together only by the mud inside them. The primary anchor of the salvage plan, the structural unity of the ship, had been severed. The engineers were left with a disaster. They had the lifting power, but they had no way to apply it without destroying the artifact. The ship was still on the bottom, but now it was broken, and the river was threatening to reclaim the pieces. The physics of the biscuit cutter effect had proven that brute force alone could not cheat the laws of material science. The failed lift forced a brutal choice. The dream of raising an intact warship was gone. With the hull compromised by the first attempt, the team had to redefine success, salvage the artifacts, the machinery, and as much structural identity as the wreck could still carry. Rather than attempt another single hoist, they planned to recover the Cairo in 3 major sections: bow, midships, and stern, each rigged and lifted on its own terms. The mass was still enormous, and each piece was still packed with wet silt and iron. But dividing the load reduced the crushing strain on weakened timber and gave the rigging a chance to work with the wreck instead of against it. The strategy was no longer about elegance, it was about extraction. Late in 1964, the second attempt began. The river was just as hostile, the water just as opaque. But this time, the geometry of the lift was aligned with the structural limits of the material. The engines of the derricks roared, taking the load. The cables tightened. Slowly, agonizingly, the first section broke the surface. It did not look like a ship. It looked like a shapeless mound of black mud and timber, streaming gallons of river water back into the channel. As the pumps began to wash away the outer layers of silt, the iron casemate armor appeared. It was corroded, scarred, and real. One by one, the 3 sections were hoisted from the darkness. They were lowered onto waiting barges, looking less like a warship and more like the disarticulated skeleton of a leviathan. The mud that had weighed them down now served as packing material, protecting the artifacts inside during the transfer. The recovery was a partial success in the strictest engineering sense. They had not raised the ship they set out to find. They had raised the components of it. The Cairo was on the surface, breathing air for the first time in a century, but she was a jigsaw puzzle of wet timber and iron. The decision to accept the structural break had saved the cargo. The cannons were safe, the machinery was safe, the personal lives of the crew were safe. The salvage team had defeated the depth and the suction, but they had paid a heavy price in structural integrity. The ghost of the Yazoo was no longer a rumor. It was a tangible, broken reality sitting on a flat-top barge, waiting to be rebuilt. The collection of timber and iron sitting on the barges was not a vessel. It was a chaotic inventory of parts, a deconstructed war machine that had lost its structural logic. The engineers and historians had pulled the mass from the river, but the final unknown was whether these fragments could ever convey the reality of the city-class ironclads. The ship had been broken by the lift, and the wood was rapidly drying out, threatening to crumble into dust now that it was removed from the wet embrace of the Yazoo. The solution was not to hide the damage, but to incorporate it into the display. After the sections were brought up, they were moved to Vicksburg, and in the summer of 1965, the remains of the USS Cairo went on again to the Ingalls shipbuilding yard at Pascagoula, where armor and machinery could be separated and the mud could be cleared under controlled conditions. Years passed in conservation work and hard decisions about what could be saved. In 1972, the National Park Service took ownership. In 1977, the reconstructed remains returned to Vicksburg National Military Park for public display under a roofed canopy completed in 1980. Instead of pretending the hull was whole, the restoration team built a supporting framework to hold what survived. Armor plating, engines, paddle wheel, and fragile timbers set back into their relative positions. The result is a ghost ship, the Cairo on display as a skeletal cutaway, where the gaps in the wood let visitors see the vessel's internal anatomy. This reconstruction confirmed the true value of the salvage. The mission had failed to raise a floating ship, but it had succeeded in lifting a rare capsule of Civil War river life. When the mud was cleared from interior spaces, many everyday objects emerged in remarkable condition. Pencils, combs, toothbrushes, medicine bottles, and personal effects that had been sealed away for generations. Ordnance and ammunition were also recovered and treated as potentially hazardous, not as curiosities. The preservation was uneven and the timbers were fragile, but the evidence was real, and it could finally be studied. The Cairo is a snapshot, caught on December 12, 1862, and held under silt. Most shipwrecks are scavenged or slowly degraded by the ocean. This one was arrested in place. The artifacts recovered provided the most complete physical record of the Civil War river navies ever found. The violence of the biscuit cutter failure during the lift was a tragedy for the hull, but it did not destroy the data. The decision to cut the ship and lift it in sections, while visually brutal, ensured that the contents of the vessel were not lost to the river forever. Today, the ironclad sits on dry land, miles from the water that claimed her. She is a testament to the sheer difficulty of forensic salvage, where intention meets steel, silt, and time. The derricks and cables followed the numbers, not the dream. The USS Cairo remains the only surviving city-class ironclad on public display, one of only a handful of Civil War-era gunboats still in existence, a hard-luck ship killed by a mine, buried by a river, damaged in recovery, and finally preserved by people who refused to let her vanish.